I know you're a convert to the Catholic faith from Anglicanism. Could you first tell us, did the Pope have any impact on that journey?
He had an enormous impact. For many years, I'd been thinking personally about making the journey into the Catholic Church from the Church of England. But when Pope Benedict really gave a strong lead in wanting to defend the faith against worldliness and uphold all the doctrines, that inspired me enormously. And when he announced he was going to open the Ordinariate for people who wanted to come across but retain their English patrimony, I was one of the very first people. I just knew in my heart I wanted to go. He was a huge inspiration, a great theologian, and a great man of God.
Well, I don't think that's emphasised enough that he was a great theologian. I read his book recently, The Jesus of Nazareth, which for me just speaks entirely of what Jesus was about. But it's great to have church leaders, isn't it, who are theologians, who have that background, who can be leaders of the spiritual realm as well as the earthly realm.
I think it's essential, and I would actually say probably the most important thing about Pope Benedict is that he was one of the most learned men in church history. I genuinely think he will become a doctor of the church. I think there have been very few people as intellectually capable as him. His legacy to the church is really going to be found in everything he wrote, which was exhaustive. And really, I think, I was really touched when he came to England and walked with Her Majesty the Queen. And I really did think we were seeing the end of a very great generation, the likes of which we've not really seen since. There seems to have been a dumbing down throughout the 20th century, and I think our leaders aren't quite as impressive as the generation before them. This was a man who spoke many languages, a man who knew ancient church history, who had studied the fathers, and every time he spoke, it was just pearls of wisdom. And really, I don't think there's a prelate alive who's really at the same standard that he set for the church.
Well, he followed in huge footsteps as well, didn't he? Of course, Jean Paul II made him prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. But prior to that, he was actually quite a liberal priest, wasn't he, before he became a cardinal?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that the world has in understanding popes is it tries to see them through a worldly political lens. So people want Pope Benedict to be the traditional conservative, Pope Francis to be the liberal lefty. But actually, they don't often work, those titles. I would say there are two very distinct schools of thinking in the church. One of them is quite modernist, wanting to open the church up to the world, and that would be really Francis's steer. Pope Benedict stood for the other great school of thinking in the church that says we need to preserve the wisdom of the past, obedience and fidelity to it. And that really is, I think, again, where he came in. So he was very liberal in terms of wanting to embrace everyone and reach and speak out to the world. He was liberal in the good sense of the word, What he wasn't was a big left-wing politician, which is what the world wants the Pope to be.
But Father Ed, the Catholic faith is a faith rooted in tradition, obviously. It's handed down from Christ through the apostles to us. We believe in apostolic succession, etc. It's a faith that is rooted in tradition. And many are saying that with the death of Pope Benedict XVI, there is no longer a leader holding on to that tradition, and the modernists will get their way, and the church will be opened up to the world and become of the world.
Well, I think I would say that actually Pope Benedict inspired a lot of very young Catholics. So I think the reality is, in the long term, I have great optimism for the church. I think today, if you're going to be Catholic, you want the faith in its fullness. I see a lot of young people who hunger to be faithful, who hunger for the beauty of the ancient Mass, all these things. The difficulty, I think, is that we have got a generation in power at the moment who are probably the boomer generation, whose entire ministry was spent trying to kind of bring in felt banners and, ban the bomb type religion. Very Anglican in a sense. And so we've got this little bulge at the moment where I think power's a little bit too much in one camp. But actually there aren't many young people who are inspired by that. So I think in the short term, we've got a rocky road, but I think in the long term, the church will come back roaring into life, actually, as more people realise that perhaps the wisdom of the church down the ages is something missing from our rather vacuous and confused culture today.
I hope you're right, but to give a practical example, of course, Pope Benedict was in favour and helped encourage the use of the Latin Mass, whereas Pope Francis, of course, has almost outlawed its practice around the world, and more traditional Catholics are looking towards things like the Latin Mass to re-find truth and beauty and goodness. So where do you see that happening?
Well, I'm a great optimist. I believe in the power of the Holy Spirit. And I would say that, there's a great, lovely story that Napoleon once said to the Pope, "I'm going to destroy your church." And the Pope said, "Well, we Catholics have been trying for 1,500 years and we've not managed it." I do think we've got some real challenges. I think there are some very politically motivated ideologues in power in the church at the moment who are trying to suppress and thwart people who simply want to be faithful. And, so I do think there is a culture battle going on. But in a way, I think those of us who love Pope Benedict, the way we can really honour him is to fight for the true faith, to dare to stand up and be counted. And actually, the good news is, we've got God on our side. So I'm feeling quite positive.
Yeah, or rather, we're on the side of God. Father Ed, to give us some good news, tell us about the Ordinariates and the great work that Benedict put through there to help Anglicans keep their patrimony whilst joining the communion with Rome.
Well, it's tremendously exciting. I mean, Pope Benedict, many people may not realise, was a great Anglophile. He loved this country, and he loved especially the great St. John Henry Newman, a man who famously had been raised as an Oxford academic, a member of the Church of England, but who became Catholic and ended up being quite instrumental in his writing and indeed in influencing the Second Vatican Council. So Pope Benedict realised, I think, that in a sense, the English way, that the Anglican patrimony has lost its true faith. And the more that the Church of England was just becoming very worldly and into environmentalism and all that, there was a real need to retain the best of Anglican patrimony, which is English patrimony. A reminder that actually Oxford and Cambridge, our great schools, our great universities, all of these were forged in England when it had a beating Catholic heart. So he asked those of us to come over, not to just go native, but to hold on to the story of pre-Reformation England, the fact that actually Western culture is a Catholic Christian thing and something worthy to be preserved. So we've entered the Catholic Church and we have our own Mass with Cranmerian, beautiful language, all stemming from the very ancient rites that were here in England before Henry VIII took his wrecking ball out. We've kept some of that beauty, some of that, and a real emphasis on the English saints. We've got Cardinal Newman, now St. John Henry Newman as a patron, Our Lady of Walsingham, the great story there. A really English feeling way of being Catholic to remind us what really unity is all about. It's a tremendous gift. We are, in the Ordinariate, I always like to say, Benedict's babies. I think he's one of our patrons too, really.